Hey, this is Miss McIntosh, and I am talking to you today about London by William Blake. Now, the first thing we need to think about is how to get to the top band with London. As with every other poem in the anthology, you only have 20 minutes to get your 15 points. And that means that you've almost certainly annotated too much in your collection already. So what we need to think about here is what you really need to do to know brilliant with it. You need to summarize the poem's approach to the theme first. Remember, the theme is going to be in the steer question. It won't always be place. How is place presented? It could be how is dread? How is war? How is depression? How is, I mean, it's unlikely it will be any of those things, but who knows what the example will come up with. You need to put the poem and author in context and explain how that shapes the poem's approach to the theme. Context is 33% of your mark. They don't need you to do much for context, but they need you to do some context. And the best way to think of it is, why does this poem have a meaning? Because of when it was written, who it was written by, what kind of world it was writing into. You need to explain the form and structure and how it reflects the poem's approach to the theme. You'll notice here, we're never just noticing things, we're noticing them and looking at how they're applied. So you could say it's got fixed form, unless you can say, and that reinforces the theme or that reflects the theme, there's no point in mentioning it. But you can always say really good things about form and structure, especially with this particular poem. And then analyze, I've said 3 to 4 moments here, could maybe be up to 8 or 10 if you're embedding them in your sentences, but really only very few key moments in the poem, key images, key words that you can zoom in on, show off about from the beginning, middle and end to cover the whole of the poem. And a tonal change, if there is one, that's your structure points and your analysis points. And a reminder there at the end, again, context is 33% and it is the part you are most likely to leave out. So we're going to start there. William Blake writes this poem in 1794, right? He's the earliest poet in our collection. He's a romantic, but we'll talk a bit more about whether or not he truly fits into that genre. But most importantly, he's writing about the world of the 1790s. And it is the most gruesome, spectacular, and amazing decade in European history. So 1789, the French Revolution has happened. The people have risen up in France against absolutist monarchy. No more, we don't want to run our country like this anymore. And to start with, everyone's kind of okay with that. The French monarchy is famously extremist, so they think that's pretty good. But by the time we get to 1794, we've begun a phase called the Terror. That begins in 1793, just before Blake writes his poem, and then 1794 when he writes it. And that's that central image there of the guillotine. So at that point, they started cutting off the heads of the aristocracy and the ruling classes in France. And when I say they started cutting off their heads, they did it wholesale. Tens and tens and tens of thousands of people had their heads cut off in these formal public executions. The streets ran red with blood, and the news was broadcast around the world to absolutely horrified and terrified European elites. Nowhere more so than in London, which declared war on revolutionary France in the early 1790s. So when Blake is writing, he's writing into a world that is at war with France, that is terrified of beheadings, that thinks that the working classes might rise up, that thinks that the poor might be a source of terrible political retribution, revenge. There's other things going on here. Over there on the left, you can see black soldiers holding up a decapitated white French head. That's Haiti. It's a French possession in 1789 when the French Revolution happens. 1791, they say, wait a minute, we want freedom too. And it becomes the largest and most successful slave revolution in history. Haiti remains independent after that. And Britain finds that terrifying too, because Britain has colonies, Jamaica, Barbados, places like that, where they have enslaved people held captive. And Haiti is right there. They're terrified that the revolution and the violence will spread, that rebellion will spread, and people won't put up with what they're being asked to put up with anymore. Over on the left, you can see some soldiers, sailors standing up on the masts of ships. Mass mutinies, revolts against on-ship order began happening in the 1790s. And the way they dealt with that, the way the authorities dealt with that, was truly gruesome. They were terrified by the spectre of disobedience and mass violence, and they responded with mass violence. So mutineers were hanged, and then their bodies quartered and hung up all the way from London down to Portsmouth and the other ports. So we're picturing a world, there's bloodshed in Haiti, there's bloodshed in London, there's bloodshed, there's bodies dripping all the way down to the port cities. As you can see from the bottom image there, there's food riots, there's mass meetings of 100,000 people yearning for change, chanting for change. They throw stones at the king's carriage, which is completely unheard of in the period. And the government responds by cracking down. They ban meetings of more than a few people. By the end of the decade, they've banned working class people talking to each other about how to resist low wages. It's an era of spying, of state violence. The police, what will become the police, are breaking up meetings. Your neighbors are spying on you. No one trusts each other. You're at war. People are being conscripted to go to war, so they're going against their will. Conscripted sailors and soldiers are trying to revolt to ask for better conditions, but they're being executed and their dripping remains displayed across the country. So it could not be a more bloody and terrifying decade. And that is the decade that Blake is writing about. So let's think about William Blake. Yes, he's a romantic poet. He's one of the romantic poets in your collection. So Wordsworth, Shelley, Keats, Byron, Blake. Have I left one out? No. But he doesn't really fit in with them. He's not one of the good-looking boys that the others all are. He's a bit earlier than them. He's not socially connected to them. But we still call him a romantic, as in he's politically radical. He doesn't agree with what's going on. He questions the process of industrialization and power that are happening. He sees inspiration in other things, just like all the other romantics do. He's an illustrator, I've said it, and a social recluse. So rather like Emily Dickinson, who wrote As Imperceptibly as Grief, he is a complete outsider. Emily Dickinson spends her time shut in her house. She suffers from agoraphobia. Her poetry is not published during her lifetime. Similarly, William Blake, he works in the print industry. He's an illustrator for London printers, but his poetry is not known. He's a complete unknown at the time. As you can see from the image there, his poetry comes with text and image associated. So this is one of his original versions of London, this painted illustrated print. When I say he's a visionary, like Emily Dickinson, it's assumed that he had quite serious mental illness. And with him, he had mania, had delusions. So he would hallucinate visions. His artwork is full of these images of like that Old Testament prophet, like Elijah, walking through London, telling us about the terrible things he can see, these apocalyptic religious images of the end of the world, the sky turning, the sun turning black, the seas turning to blood, the end of the world is upon us. And in other of his poems and artworks, he was obsessed with painting Satan rising. So this 1790s apocalyptic events, the French Revolution, the mutinies on the coast and on the ships, the crackdown on labor, the Haitian Revolution, the blood in the streets, quite literal blood in the streets. He is walking through this, the speaker of the poem, and Blake himself looking as a visionary with this apocalyptic vision, just like that old man being led by a child. That child is a symbolic figure, and we'll see the image of the young, innocent child go throughout the poem when we look at it. So, explain the form and structure and how it reflects the poem's approach to the meaning. Two things: we notice things, we learn about things, and then we say something meaningful about them. So, things to say here: it's 4 fixed and regular quatrains. A quatrain is a stanza made of 4 lines. So we've got 4 of them, right? They're exactly the same each time. It's a deceptively simple iambic tetrameter. You don't need the word iambic tetrameter, but it's fun. Iambic tetrameter is ballad meter. She Walks in Beauty by Byron is also written in tetrameter. I wander through each chartered street. She walks in beauty like the night. What to say about iambic tetrameter? Well, just like in Byron, She Walks in Beauty, it's measured, it's walking pace, it's very simple. We associate it with ballads, which are a simple sort of working class art form. So it's not desperately literary. It's not doing something complicated with the sonnet form like Elizabeth Barrett Browning is, or Keats, or Shelley in Ozymandias. It's written almost like a nursery rhyme, almost like a chant, a child's prayer. It uses an awful lot of repetition and anaphora. So repetition, you don't need the word anaphora, but if you enjoy it, by all means use it. Repetition, I wander through each chartered street, near where the chartered Thames doth flow. So too chartered. Mark in every face I meet, marks of weakness, marks of woe. So repeated refrains, like a fairy tale, like a nursery rhyme, over and over again, this simple repetition. And then anaphora is a particular type of repetition at the beginning of a clause. And we have that in the second stanza, in every, in every, in every. Okay. And then rather fascinatingly, and I didn't see this until this particular professor's layout of it, we also have an acrostic. So in that third stanza, we have the word here, here repeated, here, but it's written down at the beginning letter of every one of those sentences in the third stanza, how the chimney sweepers cry, every, and, runs, H-E-A-R. What to say about it? Well, this one's really straightforward. I've written you an example there. The government-controlled life of Britain, the chartered streets and chartered Thames of London, are symbolised and reflected in the rigid chartered meter. Okay, so he wanders through this absolutely rigid fixed form, and again that reflects back, remember, to what's going on in the mid-1790s, the government cracking down, the government controlling, surveillance, spies, laws, not allowed to meet, not allowed to be spontaneous, not allowed to do anything. You must be controlled because the elite are terrified that the people are going to rise up. And then the last part, and the most fun part, analyze 3 to 4 moments in the poem about which you can be cleverest, making sure to analyze the beginning and end, as well as some things in between. So I'm going to go through it. I've picked out my particular words there. I probably couldn't do all of them, right? I've given myself too much to analyze, but those are things I know I have something to say about, and I will probably choose some or not others, depending on what the steer is of the question and what theme I'm being asked to look at. So I've used wander, chartered, marks, mind-forged manacles, blackening church, hapless soldier, palace walls, midnight, youthful harlot, and marriage hearse. I wander through each chartered street. So chartered there, as we've discussed, ties to all of the social control going on in London at the time. But wander is an oxymoronic thing to put next to it, because to wander is to walk aimlessly, without direction, without any particular purpose. So while the chartered Thames and the chartered street and chartered London is controlled and ordered and mapped and surveilled, Blake's speaker, like Blake himself, is a free creature within it. He's walking like that prophet in the image that he created, with his eyes wide open and his ears wide open to see and hear what's going on. And all around him, the other people are chartered, controlled, as we'll see. That gets even stronger. Now, marks, mark in every face I meet, marks of weakness, marks of woe, a triplet there. 3 times he's repeated mark. Now, if we look at the picture there where I've got an arrow pointing to syphilis marks, syphilis, the marks of syphilis, which is a sexually transmitted infection, is a motif that runs throughout the poem and is one of its central metaphors. How does it work as a metaphor? Well, syphilis was a sexually transmitted infection that was completely untreatable. We found ways to treat it in the 20th century, but in the 18th century and 19th, nothing could be done about it, and it was a slow degenerating disease. Syphilis would eat the syphilis spirochetes, the little biological organisms of them, would eat into your flesh, eat into your brain, give you disordered thinking, literal sores on your faces, people's noses slowly rotted away, and it happened over years, not suddenly. You didn't suddenly get syphilis and sort of fall apart. It was a long-term falling apart. And rather crucially, for using it as a metaphor here, why it's Blake's metaphor, is that it's a congenital illness. You can pass it on to your baby in the uterus. So while you may have had sex to contract this STI, or your partner may have had sex and given it to you, the baby has had no sex at all and is just born with it and will have the same things happen, slowly eating away at their brain, slowly eating away at their skin, slowly eating away in their spine. So this image here is by a painting by a man called Hogarth, and he shows a mother who's dying. The story of this picture that goes on within this series of pictures is that the mother is an innocent young woman who's come to town, married a man who is just an absolute degenerate, who drinks and gambles and spends all his money on sex workers. He's got syphilis and he gives it to her. And as you can see, the baby that's being taken away from her has that black spot on its face. Hogarth here is showing you that the baby has syphilis, just like the mother is dying, the father is dying, the baby is born to die. So while syphilis works throughout this poem as a metaphor for generational, intergenerational rot at the heart of Britain, the innocence, the damage to innocent beings, to children, is something else that's a repeated motif. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every ban, their mind-forged manacles I hear. So there we have infants, right? Look, that repeated motif of the youngest, the infant, being part of the suffering. We have the anaphora in every. It's overwhelming all around him. He's seeing it. In every ban there means rule. The announcement of a law, so banning things, but also passing laws. The mind-forged manacles I hear. I've identified mind-forged manacles. Manacles, as you can see over there on the picture, are they're used to hold prisoners, but more specifically, they're used to chain slaves. And so slavery is being used here as a metaphor by William Blake. He's saying that the people of London, the chartered people of London, are in manacles. They're prisoners. They're enslaved. Not him. He's free. He's wandering. Everybody else is in these chartered streets and mind-forged manacles. They're mind-forged. What does that mean? Well, it means that it's their own minds that are keeping them shackled, that are keeping them in the manacles. His mind is free. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. Now in stanza 3, we get to some specifics. So chimney sweepers, like the infants before, are archetypes, images, motifs of the ruined, destroyed, and dying young. So chimney sweeps, as you know, they're very young children. They're sent up chimneys. They get terrible degenerative lung diseases and skin diseases, and they die young. They die of cancer. They die of pulmonary complaints. They are absolutely exploited, and their exploitation, their destruction, and their death, every blackening church appalls. So the church is that we're in London, which is the metaphoric center of and literal center of the kingdom. The church is the center of the people who are supposed to care, who are supposed to preach morality and religion. And yet the existence of these dying, crying chimney sweepers blackens each church. Blackening there is being used as a metaphor to mean covering with sin, as well as maybe a literal thing about the polluted nature of London, of increasingly industrial London. The hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. Hapless means unable to control what happens to you. And soldiers, we know which soldiers they are, right? So they're the soldiers for the war with revolutionary France, the soldiers who've been forced in against their will, the soldiers who, when they have asked for better pay, when they've rebelled against the people in charge of them, have been executed and displayed across the country. They're victims, right? So we've got chimney sweepers, children, infants, children, and now these soldiers shown as victims. Runs in blood down palace walls. It's a metaphor, but also it's quite within the context of this poem, within this vision that we're getting from this Elijah type prophet figure. He's seeing the blood run down the walls. He's watching it happen. He has a vision of what's happening that nobody else can see because their minds are locked up. It's a bit like when you read people talking about conspiracy theories on the internet, and they say everybody else is sheeple. Wake up, sheeple. That's kind of what he's doing. The rest of you are sheep. You're in manacles. You don't know what's going on. I've used an image there at the bottom of the page from the Tower of London when they were commemorating the First World War by with all those ceramic poppies, and it looks like blood pouring from the tower. That's what Blake's speaker, his prophet, is seeing. He's seeing that the soldier, individual soldier, sighs, cries are blood poured from the heart of the nation, because the palace there means the palace of Westminster, the palace of the king, like the heart of institutional power. And then we get to the last stanza. But most through midnight streets I hear. Now, midnight, if you wanted to stop and analyze that, that's an obvious one. We've got like the Gothic. We've got the course of the day has changed. So we've got a change in tone, change in setting. How the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. Youthful harlot, I've picked out there. Harlot is a pejorative, an unpleasant term for a sex worker, right? A prostitute. So in the world of 1794, these women will be considered scum. No one would pity them. They would think of them as degenerate, immoral, the worst possible women. But he's drawing attention to these sex workers as victims, youthful harlot. So by saying youthful harlot, he makes us think of the infant's cry of fear, the chimney sweepers, repositions these poor sex workers as actually exploited young women who are in London with nothing to sell but themselves, who have been forced into it through trafficking. Youthful harlot, reminding us that they are young, they're just babies too, and that these terrible things have been done to them with this extended syphilis. The youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear. Well, blast there is a metaphoric usage that comes from agriculture. He uses it elsewhere to describe what happens to rosebuds before they open. So a frost or a parasite will get into the bud, will cause the bud to rot inside before it flowers into a full rose. And that's the image here. The newborn, the infant, is rot inside, is already infected, is already dying, right? And that, of course, is a reference to, look back at that picture, to the syphilis. And blights with plagues the marriage hearse. Blight, same meaning as blasts. And then the marriage hearse is an oxymoron, right? So something that's completely contradictory. A hearse is the vehicle that carries you to your funeral, that carries your coffin to the funeral. Marriage, it's the exact opposite. So one is the genesis of life, new life, and the other one is death. And here they're tied together. So what is syphilis then? What is this idea of congenital syphilis, of babies born with the sins of their fathers? I think, and you can make a good case for the idea that the whole society is corrupted, is diseased, that it's about power and exploitation, about the church and the palace, about the rich elite men using the bodies of poor women, and that when those men go on to have children, the children are born with the sins of their fathers, riddled with the diseases of their fathers, even though they themselves are innocents. That this society is corrupt to the core, is blasted to the core, is plagued. So again, if we go back to the beginning and look at Blake there, and we'll look at his context there, we've got a world that seems to be irredeemable. There seems to be no way to mend it. It's a place of blood, it's a place of violence, it's a place of suffering, it's a place of lockdown, people stuck in their mindsets, people stuck in their lives. And Blake, the outsider, the social recluse, the man who sees visions, the man who sees the biblical end of the world, the book of Revelation in the world around him, is seeing this very much as the end of days, the end times. And that is the end of my lecture.